Most disturbing experiences don't begin with something dramatic. They usually start in moments that feel completely ordinary. A quiet evening at home, a routine drive down a road you've taken 100 times, sitting alone in a place that feels familiar enough that your guard is down without you even realizing it. That's what makes these kinds of stories so unsettling. Nothing announces itself at the beginning. There's no warning, no sudden moment where you immediately understand that something is wrong. Instead, it usually starts with something small. A sound that doesn't quite make sense. A movement where there shouldn't be one. A feeling that something around you has quietly shifted. And most people do what we all do in those situations. They explain it away. You tell yourself it's the house settling. Maybe someone outside. Maybe your mind just filling in gaps because it's late and you're tired. Your brain looks for the easiest explanation first, because the alternative is something most people would rather not think about. But every once in a while, something happens that refuses to fit into any normal explanation. Something that lingers. The stories you're about to hear came from people who were all certain of one thing when their nights began. Nothing unusual was supposed to happen. They were in familiar places, doing normal things, expecting completely ordinated outcomes, and for a while, everything did feel normal. Until a moment came where something shifted in a way they couldn't explain. A moment where they realized something about their situation didn't make sense anymore. And by the time that realization settled in, they were already too deep into it to simply walk away. Most people who shared these stories told me the same thing afterward. They don't like being alone anymore. Story 1. The apartment above mine. When I first moved into that apartment, the quiet was one of the things I liked the most about it. Before that, I had been living in a much newer complex near a busy road. There were always people coming and going, doors slamming in the hallway, music leaking through the walls. Even late at night, it never really felt calm. So when I found this older building a few blocks away, it felt like a relief. It was the kind of place that had probably been there since the 70s. Brick exterior, narrow hallways, thick carpets that had clearly been replaced more than once. But everything was clean, and the landlord seemed to care about keeping it in good shape. The first few days were completely uneventful. I unpacked slowly after work, figured out where everything would go, and started settling into the routine of being there. What stood out right away was how quiet the building was. I rarely heard anyone in the hallway, and through the ceiling I didn't hear much either. At the time, I assumed the apartment above me was empty. About 5 nights after I moved in, I was sitting on the couch, watching something on my laptop when I heard footsteps above me. Not loud ones, just someone walking across the floor. At first, it didn't even register as strange. I remember thinking someone must have moved in upstairs, and I hadn't noticed. The sound was normal enough, slow footsteps crossing from one side of the room to the other. But after a few minutes, something about it started to stand out. The footsteps didn't stop. Usually when you hear someone walking around upstairs, there are pauses. Someone walks to the kitchen, stops for a while, maybe moves again later. But these footsteps were different. They just kept pacing, back and forth. Back and forth, one side of the ceiling to the other. At the time, I didn't think much of it. People have weird routines. Maybe the person upstairs liked to walk while they were on the phone or something. Eventually I put headphones on and forgot about it. The next night, it happened again. Almost the exact same time. I was getting ready for bed when the pacing started. Same slow footsteps. Same path across the ceiling. It sounded like someone walking from one wall of their living room to the other and then turning around. Back and forth. Back and forth. I remember glancing at the clock at one point. It was just after midnight. The pacing continued for a long time, long enough that I eventually fell asleep while it was still happening. Over the next few nights, it became a pattern. Every night, around midnight or a little after, the footsteps would start. They always sounded the same. Calm, slow, almost methodical. And they always followed the same route across the ceiling. What made it strange was how consistent it was. There were no sudden movements. No furniture dragging, no voices or television. Just footsteps, pacing a straight line across the floor for hours at a time. I tried to come up with normal explanations. Maybe the person upstairs worked night shifts and walked around when they got home. Maybe they were exercising. Maybe they just had trouble sleeping. It wasn't loud enough to really bother me, so I tried not to think about it too much. Then one afternoon, about a week later, I ran into the landlord while he was fixing something near the stairwell. We chatted for a minute, and without really thinking about it, I mentioned the person upstairs. I said something like, "Hey, whoever lives above me walks around a lot at night." He didn't answer right away. Instead, he gave me this small, confused look. Then he said, "Above you? Primera, not death." The footsteps. Late at night. There was a pause before he spoke again. "The unit above yours is empty." I actually laughed a little when he said that. I assumed he meant it had been empty before I moved in. But he shook his head. "No. I mean, it's empty now. It's been empty for a few months." I remember feeling this strange hesitation before responding. I said, "I hear someone up there every night." He thought about it for a second. Then he shrugged and said maybe someone had been showing the apartment or doing maintenance. At the time, that explanation felt good enough. But that night, when midnight came and the pacing started again, I found myself listening more carefully than before. Because if the apartment had been empty for months, who exactly was walking up there? I tried to ignore it, but once that thought entered my head, it was hard to get rid of. Over the next few days, I started noticing other things. Small things at first. One afternoon, while I was working from home, I heard a faint creak above me, just a floorboard shifting, like someone had stepped on it. The problem was it was 2 in the afternoon, and according to the landlord, no one lived up there. That night, the pacing returned again, but this time something different happened. About halfway through the usual back-and-forth footsteps, I heard a new sound. A scraping noise. It sounded like something heavy being dragged slowly across the floor. It lasted maybe 3 or 4 seconds, then stopped. After that, the pacing continued like nothing had happened. I lay there in bed staring at the ceiling, trying to convince myself there had to be a logical explanation. Maybe the landlord was wrong. Maybe someone had quietly moved in upstairs. Maybe someone had access to the apartment and used it during the night. But every explanation felt incomplete. Eventually, curiosity started to win over common sense. About a week later, after another night of pacing, I decided to go upstairs and knock on the door. It was late, maybe around 1 in the morning. The building was completely quiet, except for the footsteps above my apartment. When I stepped into the hallway, the air felt oddly still. The lights were dim, the same dull yellow bulbs that always made the hallway look older than it probably was. I walked up the stairs slowly. With every step, the pacing above me continued. Back and forth. Back and forth. When I reached the top floor, I could hear it clearly now. Directly ahead of me was the door to the apartment above mine. The footsteps were coming from just beyond it. I stood there for a moment, listening. Then I raised my hand and knocked. Right at that moment, the hallway light above me flickered, and the pacing stopped. Instantly. The silence was so sudden, it felt wrong, like something had been interrupted. I knocked again. No response. I stood there for maybe 20 seconds, staring at the door. Nothing moved. No footsteps. No shifting sounds. Nothing at all. Then a thought occurred to me that I hadn't really considered until that moment. The pacing I had been hearing all those nights, it had always been directly above my living room, directly above where I sat most evenings, directly above where I slept. And now that I was standing outside the apartment door, the footsteps weren't moving anymore. I waited another minute before finally turning around and going back downstairs. The pacing never resumed that night, or the night after that. But every once in a while, late at night when everything is quiet, I still wake up expecting to hear it. Slow footsteps, moving back and forth across the ceiling, like someone walking the same path over and over again, waiting for something below them to fall asleep. One thing I've noticed after hearing stories like that is how quickly the mind tries to protect itself. When something strange happens, the first instinct isn't fear, it's explanation. People tell themselves it's the building settling, someone walking upstairs, a neighbor moving furniture late at night. The brain looks for the simplest answer because the alternative feels too uncomfortable to sit with. Most of the time, that instinct is probably right. Most noises in the ceiling do have normal causes. Most shadows outside the window are just passing cars or branches moving in the wind. Even the feeling of being watched can usually be traced back to nothing more than an overactive imagination late at night. But every once in a while, someone experiences something that doesn't fit neatly into those explanations. Something that lingers, even after they try to rationalize it. The next story came from someone who was convinced nothing could possibly happen to them. They weren't alone in a quiet building. They weren't walking through empty woods. They were surrounded by hundreds of people the entire time. But what they didn't realize then is something most people don't think about. Being in a crowded place doesn't always mean you aren't alone. Story 2. The empty floor at 2 a.m. A few years ago, I worked the overnight shift at a large hotel just outside the city. Officially, the position was called a night auditor, but most of the job was exactly what it sounds like. Quiet paperwork, balancing numbers from the day before, and occasionally checking someone in who arrived later than expected. The lobby during those hours always felt different from the daytime version of the same place. During the day it was full of people moving through with luggage, conversations echoing, phones ringing. But after midnight, it usually turned into this still, quiet space, where the lights felt a little too bright and every sound carried farther than it should. Most nights were completely uneventful. I'd sit behind the front desk with a pot of coffee, work through reports on the computer, and occasionally walk through the ground floor just to stay awake. Guests were usually asleep by then, and the elevators barely moved unless someone was heading out early for a flight. The hotel itself had 8 floors, and by that point I had worked there long enough that I knew the rhythm of the building pretty well. You start to notice patterns in places like that. Which rooms usually request extra towels, which hallways creaked when the air conditioning kicks on, even which elevators are slower than the others. That's probably why the phone calls stood out. It was around 2 in the morning when the front desk phone rang. Calls at that hour usually meant something simple. Maybe someone needed fresh sheets or couldn't figure out the thermostat. So when I picked up, I expected something routine. Instead, the guest sounded confused. He said someone had been knocking on his door. Not once or twice, but repeatedly. Every few minutes. The strange part was that whenever he opened the door to check, the hallway was empty. At first I assumed it was someone down the hall playing a prank. That kind of thing happens occasionally in hotels, especially if there are groups staying on the same floor. I asked him which floor he was on. He said, the 7th. I told him I'd come up and check the hallway. When I hung up, I remember feeling slightly annoyed more than anything. 2 in the morning is usually the quietest part of the shift, and interruptions like that were rare. I grabbed the master key card from the desk and headed toward the elevators. The ride up was normal. The elevator hummed quietly as it climbed, and when the doors opened onto the 7th floor, everything looked exactly the way it always did. Long carpeted hallway, soft, yellow lighting, doors lined up evenly along both sides, and complete silence. For a moment I wondered if the guest had imagined the knocking or misheard something from another room. I stepped out of the elevator and started walking down the hallway. Halfway down, I noticed something. One of the doors ahead of me was slightly open. Not wide open. Just enough that there was a thin, dark line between the door and the frame. At the time, I assumed it must be the guest who had called the front desk. Maybe he had stepped out into the hallway to see if anyone was there. But as I got closer, something strange happened. The door slowly began to close. It wasn't sudden. It moved gradually, like someone gently pushing it shut from the inside. I stopped walking. The door finished closing with a quiet click. For a moment, I stood there staring at it. Then I walked the rest of the way down the hallway and knocked. No answer. I knocked again. Still, nothing. I leaned closer to the door and listened, expecting to hear someone moving inside the room. Maybe the guest had gone back to bed, or stepped into the bathroom. But there was no sound at all. Eventually, I stepped back. At that point, my best guess was that the guest had opened the door earlier, heard me coming down the hallway, and closed it before I reached the room. It made sense at the time, so I turned around and started walking back toward the elevator. I had taken maybe 10 steps when I heard it. A knock behind me, slow, 3 times. Knock, knock. The sound was clear enough that I immediately turned around. But when I looked down the hallway, every door was closed, exactly the way they had been before. For a second I wondered if the knocking had come from inside one of the rooms. Sound travels strangely through hotel walls sometimes, but the way it echoed in the hallway made it sound like it had come from a door. One of the doors directly behind me. I stood there for a few seconds, trying to decide whether to check the rooms again. But the hallway was completely still. No footsteps. No doors opening. Nothing. Eventually, I told myself it was probably a guest, knocking on their own door, after stepping out for a second and forgetting their key. That happens more often than you'd think. So I returned to the elevator and went back down to the lobby. The rest of the shift was quiet. But later that night, when I was finishing the reports, I remembered something. The security room. Every floor in the hotel had a hallway camera connected to the main system downstairs. Normally I only checked them if there was a complaint or an incident report. Out of curiosity, I pulled up the camera feed from the 7th floor. The recording showed the hallway exactly the way I remembered it. The elevator doors opening. Me stepping out and walking down the corridor. The lighting. The carpet. Everything looked normal. At first, nothing seemed unusual. But then, I noticed something. About 10 seconds after I stepped off the elevator, one of the doors farther down the hallway opened slightly. Just a few inches. The same door I had seen earlier. I watched carefully. No one came out. The door stayed open for a moment, then slowly closed again. The camera kept recording the empty hallway. No one entered the frame. No one left the room. And no one was standing outside the door when it opened. I replayed the clip 3 times. Every time it showed the same thing. A door opening, an empty hallway, and no explanation for what moved it. I finished my shift that morning, the same way I always did, logged out of the system, handed over the desk to the morning staff, and walked to my car as the sun was coming up. But something about that hallway stayed with me. Not the knocking, not even the door closing when I approached. The worst part was the video, because when I watched it, I realized something. The camera never showed anyone knocking on the guest's door, which meant one of two things happened that night. Either the guest imagined the knocking, or someone had been standing in that hallway right outside the camera's view. One thing I've noticed about a lot of unsettling experiences is where they happen. Hotels, rest stops, unfamiliar buildings, places you're only supposed to pass through, locations that feel temporary by design. You arrive late, stay the night, and expect to be gone the next morning without thinking about it again. Maybe that's part of why those places can feel so strange after dark. You don't really know who else is there, or what happened in the space before you arrived. You assume everything is normal, because it usually is, and because you know you won't be there long enough to question it. But at least with those places, you can leave. You check out, get back in your car, and eventually the building becomes just another place you once passed through. What's harder to explain is when something unsettling happens somewhere familiar. Somewhere you've known for years. Somewhere that has always felt safe before. Because when something strange happens in a place like that, you don't get the comfort of distance afterward. You still have to live there. You still walk through the same spaces. And sometimes, you can't stop wondering if whatever happened there might happen again. Story 3. The woods behind my house. I grew up in a rural area where the houses were spaced far enough apart that you couldn't really see your neighbors unless you were standing at the edge of your property. Behind our house, there was a stretch of forest that went on for miles. As a kid, those woods were basically my backyard. I spent years wandering through them. My parents didn't worry much about it because the area was quiet, and I always stayed within a distance where I could find my way back. I knew the trails, the fallen logs, the shallow creek that cut through the middle of the forest. There were spots where the trees opened up just enough that sunlight came through in these bright patches on the ground. For most of my childhood, those woods never felt threatening. They were just quiet. The kind of quiet that you only noticed if you've lived somewhere like that. Wind moving through the leaves, the occasional bird, sometimes the distant sound of something moving through brush. Animals mostly, deer, raccoons, things like that. By the time I was about 16, walking through those woods had become routine. I'd take our dog out there most evenings, especially in the summer when the air cooled down a little before sunset. Our dog was a shepherd mix named Ranger. He loved those walks more than anything. He'd usually run ahead on the trail, stopping occasionally to sniff around while I followed behind him. The evening when things changed started like every other walk. The sun was just beginning to drop behind the trees, and the light in the woods had that dim, gold color it gets right before dusk. Ranger trotted ahead of me along the trail we'd used hundreds of times before. Nothing about it felt unusual. Then I heard something moving deeper in the trees, off to my left. At first I barely noticed it. Just the sound of branches shifting or leaves being pushed aside. That kind of thing happened all the time out there. My first thought was that it was probably a deer. They moved through those woods constantly, especially around that time of day. Ranger heard it too. He stopped walking, not suddenly, but in a way that made me pay attention. He froze in the middle of the trail with his ears up, staring into the trees. Normally, when Ranger noticed animals, he got excited. He'd bark or pull toward the sound, eager to chase whatever it was. This time he didn't move right away. He just stood there, watching. I followed his gaze into the trees, but I couldn't see anything moving. After a few seconds, I tugged lightly on the leash and told him to keep going. He didn't. Instead, he shifted slightly closer to me and stayed planted on the trail. At the time, I tried to rationalize it. Dogs act strange sometimes. Maybe he smelled something unfamiliar. Maybe there was another animal nearby that he didn't recognize. I waited a few more seconds. Still nothing moved in the trees. Eventually, I unclipped his leash. Normally when I did that, he'd immediately run ahead along the trail. But this time he didn't. He stepped off the path slightly, then came right back and stayed close to my leg. That was unusual enough that I remember saying something out loud to him. "Come on, let's go." He didn't move. After a minute I decided to keep walking without him. The trail curved gently deeper into the woods, and I figured if there really was a deer nearby it would run off once it heard me approaching. I took maybe 15 steps down the trail before I heard something behind me. Footsteps. At first, I assumed Ranger had finally decided to follow, but when I glanced over my shoulder, he was still standing where I'd left him, right at the edge of the trail. Watching, the footsteps came again. Slow, deliberate, but they weren't coming from the trail behind me. They were coming from the trees, off to my left, moving through the underbrush. For a second, I stood there trying to figure out what I was hearing, because the sound didn't match what I expected. Animals moving through the woods sound different. Faster, more scattered. You hear branches snapping, or leaves rustling in bursts. These footsteps were steady, measured, like someone walking. I called out instinctively, "Hello." My voice carried through the trees and faded. No response. The footsteps stopped. For a moment, the woods were completely quiet again. I stood there waiting, expecting someone to answer. Maybe another person walking a dog or hiking through the forest. But nothing happened. After a few seconds, I started walking again, and almost immediately, the footsteps started to... Same pace, same distance away. Moving through the trees beside the trail, I stopped. The footsteps stopped. I started walking again. They started again, to... That's when something about the situation began to feel wrong. Not frightening exactly. Just... wrong. I called out again. "Hey, are you out there?" Still, nothing. The footsteps continued to follow my pace through the woods. At that point, I told myself there had to be a simple explanation. Maybe it really was a deer moving parallel to the trail. Maybe the sound was echoing strangely through the trees, but the rhythm of the footsteps didn't change. They matched mine almost perfectly. When I slowed down, they slowed down. When I sped up slightly, they did the same. And every time I tried to look deeper into the trees, I couldn't see anything moving. Just trunks and branches. Shadows between them. Eventually, I decided to turn around and head back toward the house. Ranger was still standing near the same spot on the trail. When I approached him, he immediately turned and started walking ahead of me, toward home. I glanced back into the woods once more. The footsteps followed for maybe another 10 seconds. Then they stopped. By the time we reached the edge of the yard, everything behind us was quiet again. I turned around one last time and stared into the tree line. The forest looked exactly the way it always had. Still, dark, completely empty. No movement, no sound, nothing that suggested anyone had been there at all. But something about Ranger told me this situation hadn't been normal. For the next several months after that, he refused to walk into the woods. Every time I tried to take him down that trail again, he would stop at the edge and refuse to move. Eventually, I stopped trying. Even now, years later, I still live in that same house. The woods are still there. They look the same as they always did. But I don't walk in them anymore. At least, not by myself. Because every once in a while, when the wind is still and the forest is quiet, I can't stop thinking about something. Those footsteps never once stepped onto the trail. They always stayed just inside the trees. Just far enough away, that primera culdentisi, who was walking there. When people talk about experiences that unsettled them, they usually describe a single moment that never really leaves them. Not always the loudest or most dramatic part of the story, but the moment where something quietly shifts and they realize the situation isn't as normal as they thought it was. Sometimes that realization comes hours later. Sometimes it comes years later. It's the moment where you replay everything in your head and suddenly notice a detail you missed the first time. A sound that didn't belong there. A movement that didn't quite make sense. Something small that, if you had understood it sooner, might have changed what happened next. In a lot of these stories, the frightening part isn't necessarily the event itself. It's the thought that comes afterward. The realization that things could have gone a very different way. If someone had stayed a little longer, if they had walked a little farther, if they hadn't turned around when they did. Those are the details that tend to stay with people the longest. The final story came from someone who had that realization later, long after the situation was already over. Story 4. The late night ride. This happened during my second year of college when I was staying on campus late most nights. I had a big exam coming up, and the library stayed open 24 hours. So it wasn't unusual for me to leave around 1 or 2 in the morning. That night, I remember feeling tired but relieved. I had finally finished studying and just wanted to get back to my apartment off campus. It was about a 15-minute drive, and I didn't have a car at the time, so I usually just ordered a rideshare. The car showed up within a few minutes. It was a dark sedan. Nothing unusual. The driver looked to be maybe in his 40s. When he got in, he nodded politely and said my name to confirm the ride. Everything about the start of the trip felt completely normal. The streets near campus still had a few cars moving around, and the driver followed the usual route out toward the main road that led to my apartment. I leaned back in the seat and checked my phone for a bit while we drove. About halfway through the trip, I noticed we were approaching an intersection where the driver normally turned left. Instead, he went straight. At first, I didn't. The question italiano. Drivers change routes sometimes to avoid traffic or construction, and the navigation on the app can update without passengers noticing. I assumed that was probably what had happened. But after another minute or two, The surroundings started to look unfamiliar. The streetlights became more spaced out. The buildings along the road looked older and less maintained. Eventually, we passed a stretch where there weren't really any buildings at all, just large fenced areas and empty lots. I looked up from my phone and checked the map on the rideshare app. The route still showed us traveling along the main road, which didn't match what I was seeing outside the window. I leaned forward slightly and asked the driver if we had taken a different route. He didn't answer. At first, I thought maybe he hadn't heard me, so I repeated the question. Still nothing. He kept his eyes on the road and drove in silence. At that point, I started paying closer attention to where we were going. The street narrowed, and eventually the car turned onto a smaller road that ran between a group of old industrial buildings. Most of them looked abandoned. The windows were dark, and the parking lots were empty. There were no other cars around, no people, just the headlights from the car cutting across the pavement. After another 30 seconds, the driver slowed down. Then he pulled the car to a stop on the side of the road. For a moment, neither of us said anything. Finally, I asked, "Why did we stop?" The driver didn't answer right away. Instead, he slowly turned in his seat until he was facing me. And then he said something that still unsettles me when I think about it. "I thought you said this was where you wanted to go." For a second, I didn't understand what he meant. Then I said, "No, my destination is still the same." I remember trying to keep my voice calm, like there had just been a misunderstanding. "I think there's been a mistake. Could we go back to the main road?" The driver stared at me for a few seconds. Then he turned back toward the windshield. Without saying anything else, he put the car in drive and pulled back onto the road. Within a couple of minutes, we were back on a larger street, and soon after that, the city lights started appearing again. Traffic picked up slightly, and everything outside the car started to look normal. The rest of the ride was completely quiet. When we reached my apartment building, he stopped the car and said the ride was complete in the same calm voice he had used at the beginning. Nothing about the end of the trip seemed unusual, but later that night, something bothered me enough that I opened the rideshare app again. I pulled up the ride history and looked at the map. According to the route shown there, the car had never left the main road. The entire trip appeared as a straight line from campus to my apartment. No detours, no side streets, no stop near any industrial buildings. Just a normal 15-minute drive. Which means one of two things happened that night. Either the map was completely wrong, or the road where we stopped was never part of the route at all. One thing that stood out to me after hearing all of these stories is how similar the endings are. Not because something dramatic happens at the end. In fact, it's usually the opposite. Nothing gets solved. The person in the apartment never learned who was pacing across the floor above them every night. The landlord never found anyone living in that empty unit. No explanation ever showed up that made the sounds make sense. The hotel employee never figured out why the door opened on the security footage when no one was standing in the hallway. The recording stayed exactly the same every time it was replayed. And the guest who complained about the knocking eventually checked out the next morning without mentioning it again. The person who heard footsteps in the woods never saw who was moving between the trees. No one stepped onto the trail. No one answered when they called out. And even now, years later, the forest behind that house looks exactly the way it always has. And the college student who took that late-night ride still has the same route saved in the rideshare app. A straight line. No detours. No detours. No quiet industrial road. Just the trip that should have happened. The strange thing about experiences like these is that people often expect them to eventually make sense. We assume that if we wait long enough, or look closely enough, the missing explanation will appear. Usually that's true, but sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes the event stays exactly the way it was the first time someone experienced it, incomplete, slightly out of place, and impossible to fully explain, and that uncertainty tends to linger. Most of the people who told these stories said something similar afterward. They don't claim they encountered anything supernatural. They don't insist that something impossible happened. What they say instead is much simpler. They just know that something happened. Something that didn't behave the way normal situations are supposed to behave. Something that left a question behind that never quite went away. And in a strange way, that can be more unsettling than a clear answer. Because if there's no explanation, there's no clear boundary around what happened. No reason to believe it couldn't happen somewhere else. Or to someone else. Most people move on from experiences like these, eventually. Life keeps going. Routines return. And the memory fades a little over time. But sometimes, in quiet moments, the thought still returns. The same small realization that something about that moment never fully made sense. And that the situation could have unfolded differently. Most of the people who shared these stories told me the same thing afterward. They don't like being alone anymore. Because once you experience something like that, it's hard to completely shake one final thought. That whatever happened that night could happen again. maybe somewhere ordinary, maybe somewhere familiar, maybe somewhere quiet, maybe even tonight.